Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and I am delighted to welcome you to this session in the George Talks Business Series. Now, before I introduce today's guest, let me introduce our moderator for those in the audience who were not able to join us last week. So please join me in welcoming back Professor Danny Leipziger, Professor of Practice of International Business at George Washington School of Business and Managing Director of the Growth Dialogue. Dr. Leipziger was previously Vice President of the World Bank for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management. He was the Vice Chair of the Spence Commission on Economic Growth and Development, and Dr. Leipziger is a prolific author of numerous books, refereed journal articles, and opinion pieces for Vox EU, Project Syndicate, and other outlets, as well as he has made several guest appearances on BBC, CNN, CCTV, and Bloomberg. We are fortunate to have him on our faculty since 2009. Thank you, Danny, for moderating the session today.
Thank you, Anuj.
It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome our guest, Dr. Michael Spence, who is joining us live from Milan, Italy. Dr. Spence is the Philip H. Knight Professor Emeritus of Management in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, a Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and a Distinguished Visiting Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an adjunct professor at Bocconi University in Milan and an honorary fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford University. In 2001, Dr. Spence received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his path-breaking work in the field of information economics. He was the chair of the Commission on Growth and Development. He is a regular contributor to Project Syndicate, and he is a much sought-after speaker and advisor on global economic trends. It is my privilege and honor to welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Michael Spence. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Spence.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very kind introduction.
Well, Danny, it's all yours now.
Very good. Thank you, Anuj, and welcome, Mike. It's delightful to have you on our program here. So basically, I'm going to initiate a conversation around a variety of topics, and we'll also try to weave in a couple of questions that have been sent in by faculty and students at GW. So I want to start, obviously, with the pandemic, Mike. Yesterday, the IMF said that the outlook for the global economy was for a long, uneven, and uncertain period. And obviously, the pandemic has had major effects on labor markets, capital markets, and businesses and households are all trying to adjust. So my real first question to you, and you are in a great position to answer this because you're sitting in Italy, which was the epicenter early on of the pandemic. Do you see long-lasting effects of this pandemic in terms of economic performance and what we can expect to see in the global economy?
Hey, Danny. Well, it was good to be with you again. You know, I should say at the start, Danny was sort of my boss when we were doing the Growth Commission work together, and we got to know each other very well. So this is a treat. Yeah, Danny, I think on my side, I would say that there's clearly going to be long-lasting effects, some, positive and some negative. On the positive side, we've seen a digital acceleration, which will, complicate things in some dimensions, but overcome some natural inertia in the system that we all know about. People experiment, organizations experiment, less quickly than is ideal unless forced to. And so a lot of that's happening. And that's probably, the surest long run effect. When you get past that, are we going to experience real large amounts of economic damage at least in some sectors? I think there's a reasonable chance we will. But it really does depend on how fast we get the pandemic control, at least the way I see it. So, you and I both know that the pandemic has, because of extremely aggressive action, has been controlled in a number of Asian economies, including China. So there, I think we're going to see less lasting damage. And the hope is we get it under control in other places, Europe and America, and limit the kind of negative effects, loss of businesses, permanent losses of employment, that kind of thing. And finally, I would say in the developing countries that better than anybody I know, um, where their tools for buffering this shock are much more limited, less fiscal space, less borrowing capacity, less capacity in the medical system. There, I think, is probably the place where we ought to watch out for lasting damage and see if there are ways that it can, with international cooperation, it can be mitigated.
No, I think absolutely. And the latest work coming out of the World Bank and other places about increases in poverty that we can expect as a result make this point really very clear. One of our questions came in from a student, Mike. This came from David.
Yep.
He wanted to know whether or not there were ways to manage growth to avoid sending more people into poverty. And I think it very much relates to your observation on the emerging economies and the additional challenges that we face there. So I wondered if you had any views on that.
Well, yes. I mean, it's kind of the same story. That is, we, without tools and armament to deal with this. Now, let's start again. If you look at the developed economies, they have all had balance sheets, especially on the sovereign side, that were big enough to buffer the shock. Now, whether they're going to use them, I mean, there's a big question right now in the United States about whether, we're going to get another round of what they call stimulus, but it's actually shock buffering, spending into the economy. If they don't, then I think the probability of lasting damage and even some increase in poverty is likely. But if you switch to the developing countries, especially the ones that have just emerged and had very substantial poverty reduction, but have a lot of people near the borderline, you know what I mean, yeah. Right? That is, they've crossed out of the poverty category, but they're not, several $1,000s above it in terms of per capita income. There, I think this shock will actually push people back into it. And then the hope is that it's temporary, right? That it's a shock, they get pushed back and then emerge again. But that really depends on whether the economy's been damaged or the growth and employment engines can start up again reasonably quickly.
Right. Let me shift gears a little bit, Mike. I know you've been giving some thought to this, but in our business school, we talk about changes in global value chains, disruptive technologies, what's happening in the digital economy. A lot of these were, to use the current vernacular, pre-existing conditions, but the pandemic made them more dramatic. So I wondered how you see this shift taking place, because in some of the articles you've written for Project Syndicate, for example, you talk about the different shares going to capital and to labor, and the fact that this trend towards digitalization and economizing on labor as we knew it in the past is a trend that will continue. So I wondered if you had views on the future of the digital economy and how that affects the way business operates.
Right. So this is, so we're in the midst of a digital acceleration. I think, as you said, it was a pre-existing condition. So this is an acceleration, not a new phenomenon. An element of it is automation, turbocharged by artificial intelligence. And I think, the acceleration will make the challenge of dealing with skills and stuff associated with work greater than it was before, but it's still there. There's a flip side to this that isn't as discussed as much in the West, which is that there are opportunities for inclusive growth using the digital technologies that weren't there before. I mean, we can make this kind of esoteric, but I'll try not to do that. I mean, basically, with massive amounts of data and artificial intelligence operating on that data, you can, and the other characteristics of digital technology, so like distance doesn't matter and time gets compressed and and all that other stuff that we've known about for 25 years, you can serve people who are in the development literature referred to as sort of, remote or low access populations using digital technology. You can do that in healthcare. You can do it in e-commerce. You can do it with huge effect in finance. I mean, I'll just give you one example that you and I've talked about before. But with the right amount of data, you can take people who are completely anonymous in a pre-digital era with respect to the financial system. No collateral, no history, barely an identity that can be verified, and using their activity in a digital economy, e-commerce, mobile payments and stuff, and a massive amount of data that gets accumulated. You have enough data that the algorithms can assess their creditworthiness, and we see this starting to have a major effect in places like China. China is pretty far down the road in this respect, but so underserved populations and deploying digital technology, not necessarily to stimulate growth, and inclusiveness strikes me as a huge opportunity.
Right. So I think I want to pursue this a little because I think on the plus side we have the opportunities that you describe. At the same time, as you and I both know, income inequality has gotten much sharper in many countries, and this one can relate to labor's share of income and et cetera, other phenomena. So there is this possibility to improve the situation, but there's also a downside, which would require some transfers and some smart investments by government to offset some of the inequality that is arising. So one follow-up question has to do with the inequality issue. And the second, on the digital side, has to do with regulation, because the way we have traditionally regulated firms may not be the right way to regulate some of these new digital companies. Anyway, either question is fine, or both.
No, let me take a swing at it. I'll do the second one is clearly just right. So we're heading for 10 years ago, we did not really appreciate the downside risks associated with a totally open internet, right? The echo chambers, the misinformation, the data misuse, the data security vulnerabilities, a whole lot of things that we just kind of, it's not that nobody had ever thought about them, but we didn't take them seriously. So now we're going to take them seriously, and the internet's going to be regulated, and it's going to be regulated at the national level, and the regulations aren't going to look similar, which is causing fragmentation. And I don't think there's any way to avoid that. We're just going to have to live with it. But we are, I think, going to need to take care of at least the data privacy and security problem. Now, whether people should own their data, whatever that means, or they should have rights, is something that we'll have to sort out on the way through. But if we don't sort it out, then that will be a significant headwind to get to achieving the benefits, right? Because the benefits come from, responsible access to and use of data. And if we can't guarantee the responsible, part, either by regulation or values and norms or some combination of the two, then we're not going to get there. And people are going to stop using it, or governments are going to shut it down, or whatever. So I think that's the path we're on. And I'm not particularly pessimistic about it, but it's very complicated territory. So, for example, here's a prediction. Most countries are going to require that data, and in the case Europe is a country in this context, data be housed physically in the geography in which it's being generated and primarily used. Well, that's all very well, but what about a multinational business running on a digital platform if there are serious restrictions to data mobility, right? We just, kind of like haven't thought it through. So there's lots of complexity going down that road. On the income distribution side, you're right. I mean, I think we had a long time where the only people who were really seriously talking about inclusiveness and growth patterns were you and your colleagues at the World Bank. I mean, you were responsible for the poverty reduction economic management processes at the bank, and but the rest of it, the rest of the world, including the economics profession, was sort of busy semi ignoring the problem. That's not a problem anymore. We have Piketty's work, Raj Chetty, Emmanuel Saez, and a host of sort of excellent, deep empirical work. We've got the work on poverty that Abhishek and others have done. So we're in better shape on that front. And so I think now we've got the problem not of sort of ignoring the problem, but of actually doing something about it, or at least proposing solutions. And here's the part that I wrote about recently that I think is really hard to get at. If you look at sort of value creation as it appears in the public equity markets, it looks like two things are striking. One, an increasing fraction of that value creation appears to be associated with intangible assets, especially digital ones. And second, being generated by a very small number of people relative to the magnitude of the value that's been created. I mean, I don't want to sort of be too long-winded about this, but Ant Group in China is going to go public at a valuation of $300 billion. That's approximately the same as the valuation of JP Morgan Chase. And the rest of the digital platforms are multiples of that, like 2, 3, and 4, right? I mean, this isn't sort of a minor observation vis-a-vis, what's going on in the world. So now you ask sort of the question. So that's where the value is being created, not in a whole range of industries where value is created when you're not in a pandemic economy by a combination of labor and tangible capital, the conventional view, right? So an increasing fraction of the returns to that value creation are flowing to relatively small numbers of people, the people who generate it and the investors in those companies. And if you ask who are those investors, it's not a random sample, out of the distribution of across the population. I mean, how many people in the bottom half of the wealth distribution in the United States have significant, relative to the size of their balance sheets, holdings in, the major digital, assets and platforms? And the answer is not much, if any. And so I think we're in an era, that's just the way it is. That's how, these intangible assets work. That does create a ton of value. And I think we're going to have to start to find ways of sharing that value creation more broadly. But I don't really know how yet.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think although stimulus packages are being worked on across the globe, the net result of that is larger fiscal deficits and higher debt to GDP. In the US, for example, it could go to 140% in the course of a year or two. And unless you're happy with those levels, and some countries, Japan and Italy have had high levels like that in the past and still do, you may decide that in order to bring that debt to GDP level down, you need sort of a temporary, I hate to say it, wealth tax, or the pandemic surcharge or something to bring it down. And the people who have that wealth are the ones that you described. And so I think the link between the digital economy and the inequality issue is a very clear one, as you've described. Let me switch topics slightly, but it's still in the same area. You and I both worked on the Growth Commission report. We had certain recommendations for what countries might want to consider if they wanted to follow the path of the dozen or so countries in the post-war period that had grown really rapidly over many decades. And then we, as a commission, stayed alive for another year after the Great Recession, just to test whether or not what we said still held water. But here we are more than a decade later with a different kind of shock and a different set of circumstances. And I think the question that some developing country ministers and leaders are looking at is, is the old prescription still valid, right? Should we perhaps not consider what we used to call industrial policy? Shouldn't we be more self-reliant, um, both in terms of import dependence as well as being able to generate jobs and incomes? So it's a little broad question, and you don't have to uh, dig in too deeply, but I'm wondering to what extent our advice today would be somewhat different than it was a decade or more ago.
Well, there's a lot of things we didn't see, and even when we were doing the Growth Commission work, we were sort of trying to summarize the best the lessons from practice on the one hand, leadership, and also research that had been accumulated in 15 years, and the world keeps changing. So the prescriptions and the learnings keep changing as well. And I think this past decade, has surely fit that description to a T. Right. First, we had the great financial crisis, which at least initially, the emerging economies ducked pretty well because they didn't hold the toxic assets that nearly brought down some of the developed economies' financial systems. And I think they thought correctly, and we even talked about this at the time, that they probably didn't want their financial system, particularly the banking part, dominated by foreign entities, who in a crisis were essentially called back to their home countries to deal with capital adequacy problems and couldn't care less about the sort of branch offices. So I think that element of, if you like, non-globalization is pretty firmly cemented now. And there's other items on the list. I mean, we did not, I think it's fair to say, Danny, didn't see the digital revolution coming, or certainly not this fast.
Right.
And that raises a ton of questions that we've talked about. Will robotics undercut the labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing and assembly, a source of comparative advantage that we saw repeatedly in these developing countries in the post-war period? And if so, what will it be replaced by, or do you need to replace it? Now, I remain convinced that you can't grow on a sustained basis at these high rates without some kind of connectivity to the global economy and global demand, right? I just, I don't see how you do it. Every demand curve small and downward sloping. You don't get specialization, you don't get scale economies, you don't get anything if you're just relying on your own economy and you're in the early stages of growth. Now, that obviously changes as you get to the middle income levels and the domestic market becomes more interesting. So I think the question before us that hasn't been answered, and will probably be answered by experience more than anything else, is, so what are we going to specialize in and interact with the global economy? And I think there's some potential in these, if the digital e-commerce platforms are as effective at connecting smaller businesses, businesses that really weren't multinational before, to a global marketplace, then there's at least the possibility that you'll have a sort of different version, digitally underpinned version of globalization that has some power with respect to producing growth and employment engines. But that's, at this point, speculation.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I know you've done a lot of work and you've had a lot of connections in China, and so I thought I'd move on to the second largest economy in the world, and not
right.
dwell on the friction part, but try to ask you, since you're usually a glasses half full kind of guy,
Right.
is there a scenario under which we can see the number one and number two economies coexisting, perhaps with different rules, rather than being so hyper competitive that we see all sorts of tensions, geopolitical as well as economic? So I wonder what your view is on China and how to make that rivalry a less dangerous one.
No, it's a great question, and a lot of people are thinking about it. So I continue to believe that the two things about China that I think are maybe not completely well understood. One is I get asked about the Cold War, over and over again, and my answer to that is that China, unlike the Soviet Union, does not have an ideology and a governance structure that they want to export around the world. They just don't. In fact, China's attitude toward other countries is the opposite, which is, everybody gets to decide what their values and governance structures are, and that's fine with them. They'll deal with you. Now, they occasionally get criticized because they deal with, leaders and governance structures and whatnot in countries that, are viewed as somewhat unsavory. But anyway, that's their attitude. They're not trying to export their version of how to run a country. So that's good news, right? I mean, they do want to have their place in the sun. The leadership has sold to Chinese citizens that this is a century in which China, will be rise again to be one of the big, important, influential, and they hope admired economies in the world. So they're on that track. But I think, with the right focus and persistence, two countries that intend to cooperate when their cooperation is beneficial and they disagree when they can't, have to disagree, can find a way to work together. And if that's underpinned by some additional international agreements, I mean, we have agreements that that neither the United States or China has violated about chemical weapons, about biological weapons. We've never used nuclear weapons with respect to each other. It's easy to imagine that we will decide we won't, at least in some dimensions, use cyber weapons against each other. And if we can disconnect via international agreements the national security agendas, it's not that they'll go away. I mean, every country, including ours and China's, is going to have a set of serious national security, military preparedness, agendas and concerns. But the question is, can we disconnect that? Because right now it's sort of screwing up the economic interactions and cooperation on other dimensions, like health, like climate change, if we get around to rejoining the club on that front. So the bottom line, Danny, is it's not easy to get from here to where we are because it's a more complex world in some respects than the one we had the privilege of living in for most of the post-war period. But I don't think we should give up the notion that we can find a reasonable balance between, if you like, strategic rivalry on the one hand and cooperation on the other.
Right. Well, that's, I think, a path what we would like to see happen. We'll see after November whether we can get back on that path. I want to move to the last topic or two. And you, as I recall, when we used to run the Growth Commission, you always referred to yourself as a theorist. And so the dominant worry in the global economy now is uncertainty. And how do you manage uncertainty? And how do you deal with risk that is, as we saw in the pandemic, more of a black swan event than a predictable kind of risk? You give a lot of advice to governments and also to corporations. Do you have any views on how we should be thinking about uncertainty in this more uncertain world? What would be a useful way to think this through?
So there's really two issues, which is, how do you think about uncertainty? Various ways to describe. Are we dealing with, known unknowns or unknown unknowns? It's a little hard to know unknown unknown. I mean, any degree of precision if you're trying to think about the risks themselves. But then there's the question of, well, so how do you conduct yourself? Recognizing that there's a world out there that is going to, come and give you a big swat every now and then, without much warning, right? So got enough examples that I'll accept the position that, the notion that we've experienced yet another once in a thousand year hit, and it happens every decade, maybe we've kind of learned our lesson that that's not actually the way the world works, and it is going to happen every decade or something like that. Then I think the resilience agenda is the one that comes to the fore. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think, you know, we tend to run economic economies and the policies that guide them, you know, with an excessive focus on efficiency and an insufficient focus on, you know, how well armed are we to experience fairly extreme distress. This has to do with balance sheets and it has to do with preparedness. And so there's a lot of dimensions to it. And I don't think, you know, it's not a question of trying to anticipate everything that's going to hit you. But even in the current context, I mean, the question of whether or not what resources you have. So Italy, where I am, as you noted a while ago, went into this with a sovereign GDP ratio of 130%, right? We already almost got put out of business, you know, in 2012 until Mario Draghi said, "I'm not going to let that happen," in his words. And so, if you want to bet against the Italian sovereign debt, go ahead, but you'll lose because I'll be on the other side of the market. And the ECB is doing the same thing. So we're actually in pretty good shape as we, you know, sail over the in the direction of 160+% of sovereign debt to GDP ratio. And we can't recover from that really quickly. But I think, you know, relying on central banks to backstop us so we don't have a convulsion in the sovereign debt market, you know, that basically we can't handle, is a really bad idea. And we should have a long-term objective, not just here, but everywhere, to move in the direction of having let me call it excess capacity, shock absorbing capability. Uh, we need it in networks. Networks are wired too efficiently and are vulnerable, etc. So there's lots of dimensions of it, but that's kind of the direction I go.
No, I think this is, if anyone's listening who's looking for dissertation topics, you know, there's a lot out there that needs further thinking. I have a couple more questions I'm just going to pose before we wrap up, Mike. One of our faculty members,
Sure.
Gergana Josteva, is in the finance department, and she knows your work on education and its signaling capacity. And her question had to do with the fact that there's some schools that are considering at the university level, as well as magnet schools in our area, getting rid of testing, right? And there are obviously questions of equity and how reliable these tests are. But her question is whether or not this is going to have a problem, you know, create problems with respect to reputation and brand, and whether or not the signaling value of education will be affected. And so we're going to ask a guy who got the Nobel Prize for looking at this.
Right. So I mean, it's a very interesting question, you know, because there's considerable pressure to move in this direction and considerable focus on biases. I mean, so on the other hand, my overall reaction is unless there's something dramatic happens in the admissions process, that is, it becomes sort of quasi-random as opposed to somewhat selective, it's unlikely that, you know, the brands that have signaling value in the world, university brands, and there are a lot of them in the United States, are going to lose that value. I think it's really dependent on the bottom line is it's dependent on the admissions process. It's a little bit dependent on what happens in the university, but that's mostly human capital transfer. I mean, we've already gone through periods where, you know, under student pressure, we've agreed not to tell employers all of their grades and stuff like that. You know, at least I seem to recall something like that from way back when I had Anusha's job at Stanford. But so, you know, I suppose you could knock out enough information to reduce the signaling value of this thing. But, you know, let me put it in its most colorful form. Unless MIT starts admitting a whole lot of students who turn out to be complete duds in computer science, I think it's probably going to continue to be a fairly powerful brand. So at this point, I'm not that worried. I guess the other thing I would say about that, and I won't elaborate on this, is that a question I've had in my mind for a long time was the internet, and so I'm going to change the informational structure of markets. And I've now decided that since we have 20 plus, 25 years of experience and big data and algorithms, I think the answer is yes. I think the internet, it's not eliminating private information, but it's closing informational gaps in a way that's by and large useful. Carry on.
Thank you. No, I think Kirgana will be happy with your answer. So another question that's sort of a little bit orthogonal, I guess, to our conversation has to do with the economics profession, where you mentioned behavioral economics earlier as, being outside of what normal microtheory would have, indicated for decades. We also have the question of the green economy and climate change, which changes the way you might consider, growth and growth accounting. And now we have the Fed doing what, when I was a grad student, was called helicopter money, but it's not exactly given that term, but pretty much analytically, that's what it is. So we have these big shifts in what we thought we knew versus what is now being thought of. How do you see the profession moving in terms of these shifting big trends that, in a way, do question some of the fundamentals that we were taught and that we have taught? How do you see the profession moving in this respect?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, because I think each generation comes along and says, well, there's some very important things that we've either learned about and discovered, or that we knew were there all along that we don't understand very well. So a combination of theory, new methodologies, new conceptual frameworks, and whatnot. So I personally think behavioral economics is an enormous addition to economics and finance, and it's not unique in that respect. So, I mean, I think there's two ways to think about it, Danny. One is when the world changes in a very fundamental way, it may take us a while to catch up, but at least people are interested. So let me, for example, 8 years ago, if you and I were talking, and we were talking about sort of macroeconomics and management as we did then, and monetary policy, would we have, concluded that we were entering a period in which there was no inflationary pressure? It was unclear whether a central bank could raise the rate of inflation, and in a world in which the Phillips curve appears to have totally vanished, or, where the parameters have shifted so much, they do not provide, a fixed point that helps them orient themselves when they're doing central monetary policy. Now, I think the answer is no, but that appears, people have different ways to describe that, but it's a challenge, right? And I don't think it's a criticism of the profession that we don't really know, don't have a definitive answer to the question, well, why do we appear to live in a world that in important structural respects is kind of completely different? And we're going to play catch up in the digital economy, I would imagine, as well, because it's happening very fast, and we don't have frameworks. My personal view, for what it's worth, is that economies, with or without a digital underpinning, are networks, and or can be thought of as networks, or having important network-like structures, and that we don't really have models that capture that very well right now. There's models of networks and work on networks and stuff like that, but thinking of an economy as a network that's sort of a quasi-adaptive system, if we could ever get our arms around that conceptually, I think that would be in addition to the things we've already talked about, behavioral economics and so on, that would be a huge step forward. But that's a personal opinion. I mean,
Right. No, this is very good. I think we're coming to the end of our allotted time. I know a couple of students asked, they're getting their MBAs, what should they, how should they find a new job? But I think we have to leave that for another George Talks Business event. But I wanted to thank you, Mike, so much for joining us and covering a range of topics. Usually we hone in on one area, but in your case, I think we've covered a very wide range. This talk will be available on YouTube and other media outlets. So students or alumni and others who are interested who haven't been able to see it live will be able to see the recording. Next week, I think there's going to be another George Talks Business with the CEO of the Melwood Foundation, which is a nonprofit in DC. So it's a continuing series. So we alternate Nobel laureates with others. But we were absolutely thrilled, Mike, that you could make it. We're delighted that the technology worked for Milan. Sometimes we're a little concerned about that. But on behalf of GW and personally, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your views with us. Thank you very much, Michael Spence.
Thank you, Danny.